It was a crisp morning at the city's private jet terminal, where the hum of luxury cars and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee created an air of exclusivity. The terminal was a place designed for the rich and powerful men and women who wielded influence like a weapon, their designer luggage trailing behind them as they prepared to board their private planes. Among the hustle and bustle of this elite environment stood Alyssa Parker, a striking woman with an air of quiet confidence that made her stand out. She wasn't loud, nor did she demand attention, but there was something about the way she carried herself calm, poised, and unapologetically sure of who she was. Her outfit was simple yet elegant, a crisp white blouse tucked into tailored black trousers, paired with polished leather flats. Her hair, neatly styled, framed her face in soft curls. Alyssa wasn't dripping in logos or flashy jewelry like many of the other passengers, but she didn't need to be. Her presence alone was enough to turn heads, though not always in admiration. As Alyssa approached the check-in counter, she could feel the weight of curious, skeptical eyes on her. Some passengers glanced up from their phones, their expressions veiled with thinly disguised judgment. To them, Alyssa didn't look like she belonged. The private jet terminal wasn't the kind of place where people like her, young, black, and seemingly unaccompanied, were expected to walk with such purpose. Alyssa was used to the stares. She had seen them in boardrooms, at high-end restaurants, and even at charity galas. But today, she wasn't here to blend in or to seek approval. Today, she had a clear purpose. She was here to claim what was hers. Her composure was unshaken as she stepped toward the check-in desk, holding her boarding pass firmly in her hand. The attendant, a young woman with a professional smile, began to greet her, but before she could finish, a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am," the voice said, firm and unyielding. Alyssa turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered security guard standing in her path. His uniform was neatly pressed, his expression hard and uninviting. There was no friendliness in his tone, only authority and something more, something sharper. His eyes flicked over Alyssa, taking in her appearance with a look that bordered on disdain. "I think you might be in the wrong place," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The terminal seemed to grow quieter for a moment, as if everyone nearby was now watching the interaction unfold. Alyssa held her ground, her face calm, but her eyes steady. "I'm not," she replied simply, her voice measured and polite. She extended her boarding pass toward the guard. He didn't even glance at it. Instead, his lips curled into a smirk, the kind that said he had already made up his mind. "This area is for private jet passengers only," he said, emphasizing each word as if Alyssa needed extra help understanding. "Not commercial flights. I'll need you to step aside." Alyssa's fingers tightened slightly around the boarding pass, but her expression remained neutral. This wasn't the first time someone had made an assumption about her, and it likely wouldn't be the last. She knew better than to lose her composure. "Please check my boarding pass," she said, her tone firm but still polite. The guard's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it grew more confident. He crossed his arms over his chest, making no move to take the pass. "Like I said, this is a private terminal. Unless you're here to meet someone, you shouldn't be standing here." Alyssa could feel the tension thickening around her. Passengers in the lounge glanced her way, some with curiosity, others with amusement. She noticed a man in a tailored suit whisper something to the woman beside him, both of them chuckling quietly as they sipped their lattes. But Alyssa didn't let it faze her. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath and met the guard's gaze head-on. "I understand that this is a private terminal," she said, her voice unwavering. "That's why I'm here. I have a flight scheduled, and this is my boarding pass. If you'd like, I can wait while you confirm it." Her calm response seemed to throw the guard off for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone like her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharper now, "I don't need to check anything. I'm telling you, you're in the wrong place. Alyssa could feel her patience wearing thin, but she refused to let her frustration show. She knew that reacting in anger would only give him the satisfaction he was looking for. Instead, she stood her ground, holding his gaze. "Then I'll wait here until someone checks it," she said. The guard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice came from behind the counter. "Is there a problem here?" The young woman at the check-in desk had finally spoken up, her professional demeanor intact, but her eyes betraying a hint of unease. The guard turned to her, his expression stiff. "I was just explaining to this guest that she's in the wrong terminal." The attendant glanced at Alyssa, then back at the guard. "May I see her boarding pass?" Alyssa handed it over without hesitation. The attendant scanned it quickly, her eyes widening slightly as she read the details. "Mrs. Parker is on the manifest for Flight 738, she said, her voice clear and professional. She handed the boarding pass back to Alyssa with a polite smile. "You're all set, ma'am. The gate will be ready shortly." For a moment, the guard looked as if he didn't know what to say. His confidence faltered, and he took a step back, his smirk replaced with a frown. Alyssa thanked the attendant with a nod and turned her attention back to the guard. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. Without another glance, she walked past him, her head held high. Alyssa paused, her heart steady as the world around her seemed to narrow its focus on this single moment. This wasn't the first time someone had dismissed her, judged her without reason. She had been here before, in countless other scenarios, but the sting of it never dulled. It always crept in, sharp and unwelcome, like a splinter under her skin. She locked eyes with the guard, her expression calm and unshaken. "I'm not," she said quietly, holding out her boarding pass for him to see. Her tone was steady but firm, her words measured as if she were speaking to a child who didn't quite understand what they were doing. The guard's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider, almost predatory. He didn't glance at the pass, his eyes staying fixed on her as though the very act of acknowledging her legitimacy would somehow undermine his authority. "This area," he began, his voice dripping with exaggerated patience, "is for private jet passengers only. Not for commercial flights, not for visitors. I'll need you to step aside." He shifted slightly, his hand hovering near the radio clipped to his belt. The subtle motion was not lost on Alyssa. It was a silent threat, an implication that if she didn't comply, he had no problem escalating the situation. Alyssa inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She wasn't about to let his demeanor rattle her. Around her, the lounge buzzed with quiet whispers and muffled conversations, but she could feel the weight of curious eyes on her. A woman seated nearby, adorned in oversized sunglasses and clutching a designer handbag, let out an audible sigh. She leaned over to the man sitting beside her, whispering something while rolling her eyes. The man chuckled softly, casting a glance in Alyssa's direction before returning to his phone. Alyssa caught the exchange but didn't react. She had learned long ago that such people thrived on eliciting a response, on seeing frustration flare in the faces of those they deemed beneath them. Instead, she turned her attention back to the guard. "Check my pass," she repeated, her voice unwavering. She extended it a little further toward him, her posture unchanged. The guard's expression hardened, his smirk replaced with something colder, sharper. He leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice in a way that was meant to intimidate. "I don't need to check it," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "I know you don't belong here." The words landed like stones, heavy and deliberate, meant to wound. For a moment, Alyssa felt the familiar ache rise in her chest, a mixture of anger and sadness that she always kept buried deep. But she refused to let it show. Instead, she straightened her spine, letting her calm gaze settle on him. "And how?" she asked, her tone cool and steady. "Would you know that without even looking at my pass?" The guard blinked, caught off guard for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "It's obvious," he said, his smirk returning, though now it seemed more forced. "You don't fit the profile of someone who should be here." The lounge grew quieter as the exchange continued. More passengers were watching now, some openly staring, others sneaking glances from behind their phones or magazines. A young couple near the window whispered to each other, their eyes flickering between Alyssa and the guard. Alyssa noticed all of it, the shifting eyes, the murmurs, the judgment in their gazes. It wasn't just the guard who doubted her. It was the entire room. She could feel their assumptions pressing down on her like a weight, but she refused to let it bend her. "You're making a mistake," she said simply, lowering her hand but keeping the boarding pass visible. "I have every right to be here, and I'm not moving until you confirm it." The guard scoffed, his hand finally reaching for his radio. "Ma'am," he said, his tone clipped, "if you don't leave, I'll have to call someone to escort you out." Alyssa's eyes didn't waver. "Go ahead," she said, her voice calm. "Call whoever you need to. I'll wait." For a moment, the guard hesitated. Perhaps he wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially in such a composed manner. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He lifted the radio to his mouth, muttering something Alyssa couldn't quite hear. As he spoke, Alyssa scanned the room, taking in the faces of the other passengers. Some looked amused, their smirks mirroring the guards. Others looked indifferent, as though they were merely waiting for the spectacle to end so they could return to their lattes and emails. A few, however, looked uncomfortable, their expressions betraying a quiet discomfort with what was happening. One man in a sharp suit glanced between Alyssa and the guard, his brow furrowing slightly. He seemed to consider saying something, but ultimately turned away, adjusting his cufflinks instead. Alyssa focused on her breathing, keeping herself grounded. She refused to let this guard or the spectators around her dictate her emotions. She had come too far, worked too hard to be reduced to an object of ridicule or dismissal. She glanced at her watch. The flight wouldn't board for another 30 minutes. That gave her plenty of time. The guard lowered his radio, his posture stiff. "Someone will be here shortly," he said, his tone smug. "Until then, I suggest you find a seat away from the gate." Alyssa didn't move. "I'll stay right here," she said, her voice soft but resolute. The guard looked frustrated, his jaw tightening. Around them, the lounge continued its quiet hum, but the tension in the air was palpable. Alyssa could feel it, thick and heavy, pressing against her from all sides. But she stood firm, her eyes never leaving the guards. This wasn't just about her flight anymore. It was about something bigger, something she had faced time and time again. And this time, she wasn't backing down. Alyssa took a deep breath, feeling the tension settle over her like a heavy blanket. She knew this game too well. People like the guard, quick to judge, slow to listen, were everywhere. They walked through life, assuming they knew everything about someone just by looking at them. It wasn't worth arguing with someone so blind to his own biases. Instead, she decided to wait. Patience, after all, was a skill she had mastered long ago. She glanced at the large clock mounted on the lounge wall. The jet she was set to board wasn't ready yet, which meant she had time. Time to think, time to observe, and time to let things unfold. With quiet composure, Alyssa turned away from the guard and made her way to a seat near the window. She set her bag down beside her and sank into the chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The whispers began almost immediately. Alyssa could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on her, their gazes like tiny needles poking at her composure. She didn't look at them directly, but she could sense their judgment, their curiosity, their disbelief. A man in a tailored gray suit sat across from her, pretending to scroll through his phone. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked up to glance at her. Beside him, a woman with perfectly styled hair leaned closer to whisper something in his ear, her lips curling into a faint smile. The man nodded, smirking as he returned his attention to his phone. Alyssa didn't react. She sat quietly, her expression neutral, her back straight. Years of experience had taught her how to weather these moments. She didn't fidget, didn't shift uncomfortably in her seat. She simply waited. The guard, meanwhile, hadn't moved far. He stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on her like a hawk watching its prey. Occasionally, he leaned over to whisper something to another staff member, a young man in a crisp uniform. They laughed, their voices low but audible enough for Alyssa to catch fragments of their conversation. Don't know why she's still here. Probably some mistake. Acting like she owns the place. Alyssa's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she focused her gaze on the runway outside the window. Planes of all sizes were parked in neat rows, their sleek exteriors gleaming in the morning sunlight. Minutes turned into an hour. The guard's smugness grew with every passing second. He seemed to revel in the idea that Alyssa was being watched, judged, and dismissed. He walked back and forth across the lounge, making a point to glance at her each time he passed. His expression was one of satisfaction, as if her presence in the terminal was nothing more than a joke to him. Alyssa remained unbothered. She had learned to pick her battles wisely, and this one wasn't worth her energy, not yet. What the guard didn't know, however, was that Alyssa had already taken action. The moment he had refused to check her boarding pass, she had stepped aside and made a call. Her voice had been calm, but firm as she explained the situation, giving precise details and ensuring that the person on the other end understood the gravity of the matter. "Thank you," she had said at the end of the call, her tone unwavering. "I'll be waiting." And so she waited. Alyssa watched as the minutes ticked by, her patience unwavering. Around her, the terminal continued to buzz with activity. Passengers came and went, some accompanied by assistants or security guards, others traveling alone. Luggage was wheeled across the polished floors, the soft hum of conversation mingling with the occasional announcement over the intercom. The guard, still stationed nearby, began talking to a second staff member. This time, it was a woman in her early 30s, dressed in a navy blue blazer with the terminal's logo embroidered on the pocket. The two exchanged glances in Alyssa's direction, their conversation punctuated by low chuckles. Alyssa noticed the woman glance at her boarding pass, which she had placed on the small table beside her. The woman leaned closer to the guard, whispering something that made him laugh even louder. What they didn't realize was that they were running out of time. Alyssa's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen, her lips curving into a faint smile. The message was brief but to the point. "I'm on my way." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned her attention to the window. The planes outside looked the same as before, but Alyssa knew that things were about to change. The guard's confidence began to falter about 10 minutes later. It started when a black car pulled up outside the terminal, its sleek exterior gleaming in the sunlight. The car was unmistakable, its design, its presence, everything about it screamed importance. The guard straightened his posture, his smug expression replaced with something closer to curiosity or perhaps concern. He watched as the driver stepped out and opened the back door. A man in a sharp suit emerged, his movements deliberate and commanding. He adjusted his tie as he scanned the terminal with a practiced eye, his gaze finally landing on Alyssa. Without hesitation, he strode toward the entrance, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Inside the lounge, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Passengers who had previously been engrossed in their own conversations now turned to watch the man enter. His presence was magnetic, his authority undeniable. Even the guard seemed momentarily unsure of himself, his gaze flickering between the man and Alyssa. The man walked directly toward Alyssa, his expression neutral, but his posture radiating confidence. When he reached her, he extended a hand, his voice calm and respectful. "Mrs. Parker," he said, with a slight nod, "my apologies for the delay." Alyssa stood, her movements as poised as ever. She shook his hand, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. "Thank you for coming," she replied simply. The man turned to the guard, his expression hardening. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made the entire lounge fall silent. The guard stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like mist in the sun. I wasn't sure if she—" "You weren't sure?" the man interrupted, his tone sharp. "Did you check her pass?" The guard hesitated, his face turning a shade paler. "Well, no, but—" The man held up a hand, silencing him. "Enough," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." Alyssa watched as the guard shrank under the man's gaze, his arrogance crumbling piece by piece. She said nothing, allowing the scene to unfold. This wasn't her battle to fight anymore. She had already won. The man turned back to Alyssa, his tone softening. "Your jet is ready, ma'am. I'll escort you personally." Alyssa nodded, her calm demeanor unshaken. She picked up her bag and followed the man toward the gate, her steps steady and deliberate. Behind her, the guard stood frozen, his face a mixture of embarrassment and regret. The boarding announcement rang out through the terminal, its crisp tones slicing through the hum of conversations and footsteps. People paused momentarily, glancing toward the gates or returning to their phones. For Alyssa, it was the signal she had been waiting for. At that precise moment, the low growl of an approaching engine turned heads toward the entrance. A sleek black car, polished to perfection, rolled smoothly to a stop just outside the terminal doors. Its presence alone was commanding, the kind of vehicle that turned heads not because it was flashy, but because it exuded quiet power. The driver, dressed in a sharp uniform, stepped out and quickly circled the car to open the back door. From within emerged a man whose very presence seemed to shift the energy of the room. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a tailored suit that fit him perfectly. His polished shoes clicked softly against the pavement as he stepped inside the terminal, carrying an air of authority that made people sit up straighter. His movements were deliberate, his gaze scanning the room like he was accustomed to being in control. Alyssa didn't react immediately. She remained seated, her expression calm, though a flicker of recognition crossed her eyes when she saw him. She had been waiting for him, after all. The man's sharp eyes swept across the lounge, pausing momentarily on the security guard, who stiffened visibly. Then, his gaze landed on Alyssa. The tension in the room seemed to thicken as he made his way toward her. The guard, who had been leaning casually against the counter moments earlier, suddenly stood up straighter. His earlier smirk faded into something closer to uncertainty as he watched the man approach. When the man reached Alyssa, his serious expression softened into a warm smile. He extended a hand toward her, his voice calm, yet filled with respect. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his tone smooth and confident. "My apologies for the delay. Your jet is ready." The room fell utterly silent. Every pair of eyes in the lounge turned toward Alyssa. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the faint clinking of cups and saucers from the cafe came to a halt. The security guard's expression twisted into confusion, his brows furrowing deeply as he struggled to process what he had just heard. "Wait, she's—" The man turned toward the guard, his warm smile replaced with a cold, sharp stare that seemed to pierce right through him. "Yes," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She is the owner of the jet." The guard blinked, his face turning pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "And your behavior here today," the man continued, his voice dropping into something quieter but far more intimidating, "has been completely unacceptable." The guard stammered, his earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of the man's presence. I thought," he began, his voice shaky. "You thought wrong," Alyssa said, rising from her seat with a grace that matched her poise throughout the entire ordeal. Her voice was calm, but carried a sharpness that cut through the silence. She smoothed her blouse as she stepped forward, turning to face the guard directly. "Next time," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "check the facts before making assumptions." The guard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his earlier bravado completely stripped away. He looked around the lounge, perhaps hoping someone would come to his defense, but the other passengers remained silent, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and, in some cases, quiet satisfaction. The man in the suit didn't give the guard a chance to recover. "You will be reported for this," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Disrespecting a client, especially someone of Miss Parker's standing, is unacceptable in any context. The guard tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to?" Alyssa interrupted, her tone still calm but with an edge of steel. "You didn't mean to ignore my boarding pass? To dismiss me? To judge me without a shred of evidence?" The guard looked down at his feet, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. Alyssa took a step closer, her posture towering over him despite the fact that she wasn't significantly taller. It wasn't about height, it was about presence. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying through the lounge. "It's about people like you, who think you can decide who belongs and who doesn't, based on nothing but your own narrow-minded assumptions." The room was so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. No one dared to speak or even shift in their seats. The man in the suit gestured toward the gate. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice returning to its earlier respectful tone. "Shall we?" Alyssa gave the guard one last look, her gaze filled not with anger, but with a quiet determination that spoke volumes. Then she turned and walked toward the gate, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As she passed through the gate, a few of the passengers in the lounge exchanged awkward glances. One woman whispered to her companion, "I can't believe she owns the jet." Her companion replied in a hushed tone, "Makes you wonder what else we've gotten wrong." The guard remained frozen in place, his face flush with embarrassment. The other staff members avoided his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Meanwhile, Alyssa walked onto the tarmac, where her private jet waited. Its sleek design gleamed under the sunlight, a testament to her success and resilience. The man in the suit walked beside her, his expression one of quiet admiration. As they approached the steps leading up to the jet, he paused and turned to her. "I apologize again for what happened back there," he said sincerely. "It shouldn't have happened." Alyssa offered him a faint smile, her earlier resolve softening slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. "But it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. The important thing is how we handle it." She climbed the steps to her jet with steady confidence, her head held high. When she reached the top, she paused and glanced back toward the terminal. Through the large glass windows, she could see the passengers in the lounge, still staring, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Her gaze drifted to the guard, who stood motionless near the gate, his head lowered in shame. With one final look, Alyssa turned and stepped inside the jet. The door closed behind her, sealing her in a world that was hers to command. As the engines roared to life and the jet began to taxi down the runway, Alyssa leaned back in her seat, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had faced judgment, dismissal, and prejudice, and once again, she had risen above it. Because Alyssa Parker wasn't just a passenger. She was the pilot of her own destiny, and no one could take that away from her. Would you like me to continue with the resolution and aftermath? As Alyssa walked confidently toward the gate, the weight of the moment settled over the lounge. Conversations that had once been filled with judgmental whispers had now quieted into stunned murmurs. The passengers who had openly doubted her sat awkwardly in their seats, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to quiet admiration. Behind her, The man in the sharp suit stopped abruptly and turned to address the staff. His tone was stern, cutting through the air like a blade. "This kind of treatment," he said, his voice measured but filled with authority, "will not be tolerated here. I expect a full investigation into what happened today." The guard, who moments ago had been brimming with smug confidence, now stood pale and visibly shaken. His hands fidgeted nervously, and his eyes darted around the room, avoiding Alyssa's gaze. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. I didn't mean," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't mean what?" The man shot back, his sharp tone silencing the guard instantly. "Didn't mean to ignore a boarding pass? Didn't mean to judge someone based on your own assumptions? Or didn't mean to humiliate a valued client in front of an entire lounge?" The staff nearby, who had previously laughed and whispered along with the guard, now exchanged nervous glances. The air in the terminal felt heavy, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Alyssa, meanwhile, remained poised. She didn't look back, didn't pause to acknowledge the man's words or the guard's shame. Instead, she focused on her destination, the sleek private jet waiting for her on the tarmac. As she approached the steps leading up to the jet, she caught sight of the crew waiting to greet her. Their expressions were warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the coldness she had endured inside the terminal. One of the flight attendants stepped forward, a professional smile lighting up her face. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Parker," she said, her voice genuine. "We're honored to have you with us today." Alyssa returned the smile, her confidence unshaken. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice carrying the calm assurance of someone who knew her worth. Back inside the lounge, the aftermath of the confrontation was still unfolding. The man in the suit wasn't finished. Turning to the other staff members, he addressed them with the same firm tone he had used on the guard. "This isn't just about one person's mistake," he said, his words carrying the weight of authority. "This is about the culture you've created here, a culture where judgment and exclusion are allowed to thrive. That ends today." Several staff members lowered their heads, unable to meet his piercing gaze. The passengers in the lounge watched with rapt attention, their earlier assumptions about Alyssa now replaced with quiet regret. One woman, the same one who had rolled her eyes earlier, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She leaned toward her companion, whispering, "I feel terrible now, I shouldn't have assumed." Her companion nodded, his expression equally troubled. "None of us should have," he murmured. "She's clearly someone important, someone we all misjudged." The whispers of regret spread through the lounge, passengers exchanging uneasy glances as they reflected on their own behavior. Outside, Alyssa climbed the steps to her jet with steady determination. At the top, she paused for a moment, taking in the view of the terminal through the large glass windows. She could still see the passengers inside, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Her gaze lingered briefly on the guard, who stood near the counter, his head lowered as the man in the suit continued to reprimand him. Alyssa allowed herself a small, knowing smile, not out of spite, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the justice being served. Inside the jet, the atmosphere was entirely different. The flight crew treated her with the utmost respect, their professionalism a refreshing contrast to what she had experienced earlier. As Alyssa settled into her seat, she let out a quiet sigh of relief. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But moments like these reminded her of the importance of standing her ground, of refusing to let others define her worth. As the jet began to taxi down the runway, Alyssa glanced out the window one last time. The terminal grew smaller in the distance, the figures inside fading from view. She felt a sense of closure, knowing that she had reclaimed her dignity and set a powerful example for anyone who had doubted her. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, the consequences of the guard's actions were becoming clear. The man in the suit had called for a meeting with the terminal's management, insisting that immediate steps be taken to address the culture of bias and discrimination that had been allowed to fester. "I want a full report on my desk by the end of the week," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "This isn't just about today, it's about ensuring that this kind of behavior never happens again." The guard, now stripped of his earlier bravado, stood off to the side, his face a mask of regret. He knew that his actions had not only cost him his credibility, but could also jeopardize his job. "I didn't mean to offend her," he muttered weakly, more to himself than anyone else. But his words rang hollow in the empty silence that followed. As Alyssa's jet soared into the sky, she leaned back in her seat, her thoughts drifting to the events of the morning. She knew there was still much work to be done, both for herself and for others who faced similar challenges. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The world would always have people like the guard people who judged, who dismissed, who underestimated. But it would also have people like her people who rose above, who stood firm, who refused to be defined by anyone else's narrow expectations. And as the clouds parted to reveal the endless expanse of sky ahead, Alyssa smiled. Because she knew one thing for certain, she was unstoppable. As the jet ascended into the sky, the world below grew smaller and smaller, the buildings and roads blending into a patchwork of colors. Alyssa leaned back in her seat, her eyes focused on the horizon. The soft hum of the engines was soothing, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere she had left behind in the terminal. She wasn't angry. Anger, she had learned long ago, was a fleeting emotion that did little to change the minds of those who chose to judge her. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not because she had proven someone wrong, but because she had stayed true to herself. She glanced out the window, her reflection merging with the clouds beyond. The faint smile on her lips spoke volumes. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last. But each time, she met it with the same calm determination, refusing to let the small-mindedness of others define her path. Alyssa thought about the guard's face, the way his confidence had crumbled under the weight of the truth. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he could read her life story with a single glance. But he was wrong. People like him often were. Her thoughts drifted to the other passengers in the lounge, the ones who had whispered, judged, and stared. She wondered if any of them had learned something that day, if seeing her reclaim her dignity had shifted their perspectives, even just a little. She hoped it had. Moments like these, Alyssa knew, weren't just personal victories. They were opportunities to challenge the status quo, to show others that the assumptions they carried were often wrong. "When you stand in your truth," she thought, the words resonating deeply within her, "no one can block your path, not even the ones who think they hold the power." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle over her. They weren't just a mantra, they were a way of life, a guiding principle that had carried her through countless challenges. The flight attendant approached her with a warm smile, offering a drink. "Is everything to your liking, Miss Parker?" Alyssa opened her eyes and nodded. "Yes, thank you," she said, her voice soft but confident. The attendant hesitated for a moment, as if wanting to say something more. Finally, she added, "If you don't mind me saying, the way you handled everything back there, it was inspiring." Alyssa looked at her, surprised but touched. "Thank you," she replied. Sometimes, the best way to handle situations like that is to stay calm and let the truth speak for itself. The attendant nodded, her respect evident. "Well, it worked. You showed everyone what true strength looks like." As the attendant walked away, Alyssa couldn't help but reflect on those words. True strength. It wasn't about overpowering others or proving them wrong with force. It was about knowing who you were and standing firm in that knowledge, no matter what obstacles came your way. Her mind wandered back to her journey, the road that had brought her here. There had been countless moments like today moments where people doubted her, dismissed her, or tried to block her path. Each time, she had risen above it, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She thought about her family, the sacrifices her parents had made to give her the opportunities she had now. They had taught her the value of resilience, the importance of standing tall, even when the world tried to push her down. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from years ago. People will always have opinions, Alyssa. But their opinions don't define you. You define you.